some people, some teams have been associated with 100% blood transfusions. If you make people have 100% blood transfusions, you think you're going to worry the slightest about whether or damage competing with COVID or giving COVID to other athletes. People don't mind about those things. But it is actually obviously nonetheless a very serious existential question. Again, obviously driven by climate change, driven by uncertainty, mass migration now, and obviously issues on the other hand of aging societies. And obviously this raises direct and indirect things. Obviously using the politics of division around migration drives the world further apart. The other thing is that obviously again makes for very much a bifurcation in sport. Visa availability stops people competing for, second tier, third tier events. And in terms of first tier, on the other hand, you have migration and passports of convenience.
And with whatever our sport we can consider, we always take this home. So I think of golf. What do I think of most recently? Live Golf, which is the manifestation of the commercialism which denies many of the values we heard Abhinav suggest this morning, and it is about naked, utter naked commercialism. And I think almost the worst elements of society. Why do spectators go to see Live Golf? To get horrendously drunk, it seems, and a bunch of other things as well. It appalls me, absolutely appalls me. But let's talk about these contradictions and sort of sources of integration. The first one is a paper by Jerry Reims, published in 1953 in the medical journal The Lancet. And this was the first contradiction, which asked the question really, are you a driver or are you a conductor? And this is a bus conductor or a bus driver. So looking at London buses in 1953, this paper was published and found that the person who's more likely to have coronary heart disease is the guy in the front, not the conductor who's going up and down stairs on the double-decker, moving back and forth outside in the rain, and basically moving all the time.
And when I look at the Sustainable Development Goals, which are far from perfect, but they're a useful reference point for us to think about how the activities we do impact on society at large, there's at least 4 that directly relate to work and employment, health and well-being, and how work impacts on our well-being and health, gender equality, reduced inequalities in general, and decent work and economic growth. And I'm going to reflect a little bit on those through the lens of sport. I really liked Robert's point about some of the contradictions, and I think if we look at sport in aggregate, there is no question whatsoever that there's a positive societal benefit. However, I wonder whether the benefits we see in youth sports always translate to professional sports in the professional sporting context. And my background in sport, I was lucky enough to be a FIBA international basketball referee, so I was involved in sport at a relatively high level, and now I coach kids, which is far more fun and far more rewarding, right? And they see the differences between professional sport and youth sport, and the value that youth sport brings to society.
I can think about sport as being a medium or an instrument that policymakers wield to bring about their big ideas. So that's a kind of big macro idea of sport, a tool, but that can be used. And then you've got sport then as the instrument or the tool of business to bring about their communication plans. The sort of classic marketing type approach. I can sponsor. I'm a company, and I can sponsor a particular cycling team, for example, which I'll come back to in a short while. Intermarché or Decathlon have their own cycling teams, and why are they doing that? Well, because they want you to see the word Decathlon. And they want those words to appear on the television. So it's a classic communications tool. But not just that. I remember when I was doing, some of my earlier research in sales. So I study sales management and salespeople. I love it because salespeople tend to be mavericks. They're great people to study. And I spent some time working with a large photocopying sales company at the time, and they used to employ ex-sports people, all right. Blethen Bowen, who played for South Wales Police, wasn't it, back in the day, captained Wales. back in the old days when rugby union wasn't professional. And we had a lot of sporting people. We had the ex-captain of Glamorgan cricket team who, again, at the end of the career, what do you do? Right? Where do you go? Well, actually, there's a company that wants you to come and work for them so that you can sell their products.
Very quick story. I'll take advantage of me being the chair. Just continuing on your example of the Carrefour Tour de Spain.
Yes,
Tour de France. Yeah. So 2012 Olympics, London, of course, and Sir Sebastian Coe, the ambassador, to bring the Olympics. And the chief sponsor for the London Olympics was Dow Chemicals. Okay. Now, business ethics, Dow Chemicals, Bhopal gas tragedy, movie also being made very recently called The Railway Man, how the railway men actually saved lots of lives in Bhopal. I must have been 16 when that happened in India, and I remember it because we lived in the center of India, which is not far from Bhopal, and in the morning there was dust all over, and we were wondering where the dust came from. Okay, so there were protests in India and in London because Sir Sebastian Coe's ancestors came from Bhopal, and he got the bid for, the London Olympics. So a classic story again of how the chief sponsorer had a history and there were protests. I talk about it in my business ethics class. So sorry I took 1 minute of being the chair. I took advantage of that. So sorry, but a very interesting story.
About 25 years ago, I was sitting on the top of a Himalayan mountain, which I had climbed up to a certain height. I happened to be a trained mountaineer, and I had the very good fortune of being trained by Bachendri Pal, the first Indian woman to climb Mount Everest. And I was sitting there reading a book when I figured out the purpose of my life. I had that moment of epiphany out of the blues. So I got my Bodhi without sitting under a Bodhi tree. I'm talking about Buddha's story, who sat under a tree and figured out what he wanted to do the rest of his life. Now, immediately thereafter, we had to summit, and we had to attend the summit. So we got out at about 11:30 in the night. That's when you make an attempt to the summit. I looked at the peak and I gave up. I said, Bachendri, I don't think I can do it. Bachendri didn't blink an eyelid. She said, all right, Himansh, if you can't do it, you can't do it. But we can't go back to the tent. We are already up, so why don't we walk for some time, and then we'll come back after half an hour or so. We walked for about 45 minutes, and then she said, shall we go back? I looked back and I realized how far we were from the base camp. I looked back at the peak again, and suddenly I realized that the peak did not look so difficult. And I said, no, Bachendri, let's carry on. And we summited that peak. There were two lessons that I learned over there on that particular day. The first lesson was, that came from Bachendri, of course, that take the first step. Any time in your life, when you think things are difficult, just take the first step and things are not going to be so difficult. And second lesson came from Bachendri when she said, Himanshu, any time in your life, if you believe that something cannot be done, just look back at what you have achieved already. And then try to draw strength from your achievements till that point of time in your life. I had been working for Tata Steel as an engineer for the previous 8.5 years. And after this, I changed my life. I went back to school, completed my PhD, and then changed to the world of academia. The reason why I'm telling you this story is to foreground what I'm going to talk about when I talk about the indigenous sports. Because one of the things that sports means in the Indian thought system is the purpose. So one of the scriptures says, Shariram Adyam Khalu Dharma Sadhanam. The role and the purpose of the human body is to actually perform the right action. And sports is not considered as a hobby. It's not considered as a pastime. It's considered as a way to develop your skills so that you can figure out the purpose of your life.
When I see the Paris Games, for example, Green Games, And then I turn my gaze to the global south, the whole question of spend and to what extent shall we push the agenda? Can we do it? Should we even invest in something? Because traditionally, the way we have sort of dealt with climate change is we have ignored it. We have had fireworks at the end of sporting events, and that's part of our indigenous tradition. That's part of the Indian way of celebration, for example, which is so critical to the global south. And at the same time, Diwali, for example, and at the same time, with every Diwali, with every celebration, with every sporting event, we are actually harming the globe. How do we come to terms with such kind of basic conflicts that exist?
The human mind's a bit of an odd thing, because humans are quite an adaptive species in many ways. But if there's too much bad news, the human mind just blanks out. And this is a sort of long story of history. Whenever societies or economies been faced with particularly grave crisis, the mind just completely blanks out. And this has obviously been pointed out by numerous scholars as the basis of civilizational collapse. Why is the human brain like that? Well, I mean, one reason is the humans as a species are very slow moving. There's not many animals that are slower than people. It's a few sloths, tortoises and a few sloths, which is a very small number. So slow moving species, very poor night vision. When of course lots of big cats have very good night vision and are quite fast moving. So the sort of horror of existence was perhaps too great unless you could blank certain things out, like night was a bad time. So again, obviously with climate change, there's lots of stuff. There's vested interest, even at the most petty level. You probably know this leak about the Shell Foundation funding far-right religious think tanks in the States, and movements, which is very, very obviously very. But it's not just more than that. It's that the sort of brain beyond a certain level just completely blanks out the situation.
To what extent, keeping in mind data protection, should we open ourselves to this? Is there an inherent conflict? To what extent can consumers share their data with these sports tourism companies or any other company that does sport? And can that data then be utilized for wrong purposes as well?
So when we, depending on where we live in the world, whether we can reject cookies or otherwise now, privacy is becoming, has become an extraordinarily important deal. But there's a price to this. If we want customization and we want to be better networked, be more aware or self-aware, then we need to give things up. So we've been doing this for a long time, and if we did know what technology companies had on us, it would put the fear of God into us. So they tell us. So they already know. So we've given it up. There's more, but we sort of leave that to it. Now it's about reaping the opportunities. I think I'm not saying we've gone too far or far enough, or otherwise that's a judgment I leave to lawyers, regulators, and others. But I think the benefit of that now becomes rich. We start teaching a marketing course. It would be segmentation, targeting, positioning. I almost don't know why we're teaching segmentation anymore. In B2B, it works. In B2C, we are segments of one. We all are unique. We operate, behave in unique, particular ways. And technology has enabled us to do that. So I think then we end up with the benefits of something that is bespoke.
Our women's team, we now have a WPL, which is sort of parallel to the IPL, but the basic contract for a man is close to about $1.5 million. And when it comes to the woman, it is about not even $100,000. And at the same time, we now say that the match fees for both men and women are equal. So we've achieved gender equality. Paris, for example, was the first gender equal games. But the world is far from achieving gender equality in the true sense. So how do we sort of combat this? Keeping in mind that the sports administrators largely it's still a male preserve.
For me, the big question when it comes to gender is understanding the causes and not treating the symptoms, right? We tend to see the outcomes, and pay is a great example, right? So because it's concrete and we can speak to it. You mentioned the examples from cricket. We talk about the examples from basketball. US soccer is a great example where the women are higher profile than the men and more successful than the men and have got pay equity. To me, that's not enough because they're more successful. They should be getting paid more than the men, not the same as the men, right? So if we focus on the symptoms rather than the causes, we don't really get to the solutions. So some of the challenges, Rob speaks about harmony in regulation and rules around sport. Are those technical commission all men? Who's making the decisions about the rules and regulations? Have we got diverse voices in those discussions that get to issues like menstruation, which is very poorly understood in sport? Maternity leave. My first paper in Harvard Business Review was on the return to work after maternity leave, and I had this great hook around Serena Williams coming back from maternity leave and being ranked 100 and something in the world because the rules did not put your ranking on hold when you went on maternity leave, so you just dropped down the ranking. Harvard Business Review hated it and took it out of the article, but I thought it was a great hook, right? But the rules didn't take that into account, right? We see, Nike reducing the sponsorship of athletes because they go on maternity leave. So the rules are written by men. The understanding of success in sport and the rules of the game are written by men. So it's important that we have those voices. As scholars, who are our subjects in our research? So do we understand women as consumers of sport, or are our subjects primarily men? Because one of the challenges for women's sports is visibility, attendance, TV numbers. In the vast majority of sports, it lags behind. But again, what's the cause? What percentage of our media coverage is of women's sport relative to men's? And how can we try to reverse those trends? They're the causes of these issues.
With the IPL, the moment, say for example, Coca-Cola signs up a particular team, we will see an inevitable Pepsi go and sign. So for example, if Professor Rai is the brand ambassador of Coca-Cola, according to the IPL contract, the rival organization will not be able to use Professor Rai's image because he's already signed up. But what he can do is, he can use him, Vijay and yourself in a commercial. So what the other rival organization will inevitably do is go and sign a team where he is part of, and then we'll put up 3 people during the months of the IPL and make surrogate. And there is nothing that stops it. The best example is Virat Kohli. Virat Kohli was with Puma. Adidas kept doing the same thing with Royal Challengers Bangalore. How does sport grapple with these inherent contradictions?
Companies that drive the rhetoric, talking to the consumer and creating culture. Because that's what marketers do as well. They create culture. They create cultural discussion. So, I was looking at some of the old Nike adverts that we had. If you go back to '96, one of my favourite adverts was what was it? Good versus Evil. And if anyone can remember that, it had a classic scene where Eric Cantona, they're fighting the devil's hordes, and Eric Cantona puts his collar up and says au revoir before blasting a football through the chest of Satan to score the goal, which meant that we beat the devil's hordes. And then so you have this sort of very machismo attitude. Then you have there was a great, one of my favourite adverts of the late 2008, produced by Guy Ritchie. A fabulous advert. And what was it called? It was called The Next Level. A fabulous advert, dripping in toxic masculinity, where it tells the story of a young footballer who's playing park football, who works his way up. He's spotted by Arsene Wenger, becomes a Premiership player for Arsenal, eventually in the Champions League, and then eventually playing for his national team. But on the way, if you watch the director's cut of this video, along the way he engages in all sorts of behaviours that we wouldn't approve of nowadays. Let's put it that way. Signing body parts of young ladies, going through the young ladies in great numbers, having excesses in all sorts of ways. But it was celebrating that sort of a toxic masculinity that Nike were really pushing forward. And then, of course, you got the alternative. 2020-ish. You've got Marcus Rashford. Booting the ball and eliminating toxic masculinity from the scene. There, it's gone. gone. And I was reading up on it, New York Times sort of said that the reason that there was this sort of evisceration of the toxic masculinity was because there was a change in personnel within Nike. Nike themselves had got a much more female-based leadership base, and they changed the way that Nike itself was a bit of a toxic cesspit, which is really interesting because did anyone see the 2024 Nike Olympic advert, right, with William Dafoe reciting, going right back, getting lots of criticism from the ride-ons, because William Dafoe is commentating. We're watching Olympic athletes in their raw state, sweating, working like heck, trying to win. Now, winning and beating is deemed sort of almost like a toxic thing. But William Dafoe comes back, and where's he go? He says, he narrates the athlete's thoughts. There you go. I have no empathy for you. I don't respect you. I'm never satisfied. Yeah. I have an obsession with power. And this is all, and that's, celebrating the athlete's focus. And yet some people say, no, what's going on now? So it'll be interesting to see where Nike go with their campaigns. Are they going to continue to push those sorts of narratives and create a new toxicity?
When I see the discourse of global sport, I see it's Western. It's still that paradigm of Western sport. Take Olympism, take the whole Coubertin example, take the whole history of modern international sport. And I don't see indigenous sport from the global south. I don't see the global south. I see an Anglo-Saxon narrative being pushed down our throat, and we then follow that narrative rather than even getting into this. So how do we bring this back? Is global sport truly a global sport? Is there an international history of sport at all? Or are we talking about two different parts of the globe?
I still recall there used to be a MasterCard advertisement which would talk about something, very, very soft, like love between a child and parent. And then the tagline was, there's some things money can't buy, for everything else there's MasterCard. And subsequently I was teaching a course called Justice, Ethics and Morality in my good old teaching days. And I started having a session on forget things that money can't buy. What are the things that money should not be allowed to buy? And we had a discussion. We used to have a 75-minute discussion. One of the examples was, say, selling organs. Money should not be allowed to buy, organs. It should be a voluntary kind of an activity, so on and so forth. So the point I'm trying to make is that many things where we say that Global South does not find a voice has some historical roots to it. And I think, however, I'm not kind of dismayed because I believe that the engagement and the conversation has started around it. For example, if a question is asked, and it's a genuine question from somebody who would not want to get into history as to why does a country of 1.5 billion people does not win an Olympic gold medal this year? But the answer is that till 1580, India's contribution to the GDP of the world was anywhere between 30% to 25%. 30% at its peak, 25% at its worst. And then the East India Company happened and the British Empire happened with no malice to anybody. And then now our GDP is nowhere. And there's a direct correlation between the prosperity of a country and the engagement that is had with, which has got nothing to do with the fundamental needs. And therefore, the voice of Global South will come once we become more prosperous. Just to give an example, I talked about Kabaddi. Kabaddi is a part of the Asian Games. Sooner than later, it will become a part of Olympics. Cricket, as we were discussing last evening, may become a part of it's already a part. So it is going to become an essential part of the competitive, this thing. Because if you look at the kind of sports which are actually played in competitive tournaments such as Olympics or Commonwealth, etc., essentially come from a either very, very consumerist perspective or something which is very native to, for example, how would an Indian sports person ever be good at ice skating? We don't have ice. Now, we can't be good at ice skating. Clearly, if you have events, lots and lots of events which are related to running, there are geographical advantages that certain category of people would have because it is native to them. And I think that is where conversations ought not be merely around gender, but like you pointed out about disability, but also about what kind of sports should be included and what kind of sports should not be included.